Since 1988, more than 16,000 people have vanished inside Alaska's most mysterious region, a rate over 4 times the national average. Planes disappear from clear skies without a trace. Entire camps are left behind, meals half finished, fires still smoldering, but no living person in sight. And that's only one of 19. Each step forward takes us deeper into Alaska's shadows, where the stories don't just get stranger, they get terrifying. By the end, the real question isn't how many vanished, but why anyone dares to go back. So settle in like you're bracing for an Alaskan night. Shut the blinds, imagine the snow pressing against the windows, and let the outside world go cold and quiet. Because what you're about to hear isn't just strange, it's true. And if mysteries like this are your kind of thing, consider subscribing. Now, let's step into Alaska's wilderness, where even the land itself seems to swallow people whole. There is an area of Alaska so large it dwarfs California, stretching between Anchorage, Juneau, and the Barrow Mountain Range. People call it the Alaska Triangle, and for decades it has carried a reputation that unsettles both locals and experienced explorers. Planes flying over it have vanished from radar, sometimes in clear weather, with no sign of struggle or mayday calls. Hunters, hikers, and entire camps have been reported missing there as if they stepped off the earth itself. What makes it more disturbing is how empty the land feels. Glaciers, mountains, forests that expand for hundreds of miles, and beneath it all, the bulk of disappearances that never end with answers. Since the late 1980s, more than 16,000 people are documented as gone within this boundary. Statistical charts highlight the scale, but the stories behind the numbers tell something different. These aren't only lone backpackers braving deep snow or isolated hunters facing predators. Some who vanished were professionals with survival training, pilots with years of flight experience, even entire groups familiar with the terrain. No age group or lifestyle protects against it. Families living nearby have grown used to rumors that stretch further than natural hazards. When so many vanish without remains or wreckage, speculation fills the space, and in Alaska, the speculation always points to something darker. One of the most famous cases involved a high-ranking politician. Congressman Hale Boggs boarded a small aircraft in the 1970s flying from Anchorage to Juneau. Radar lost the plane, and despite the largest combined air and ground search effort at that time, no debris was recovered. For weeks, military aircraft crisscrossed the triangle, tens of thousands of square miles of wilderness tracked with careful sweeps. When nothing appeared, investigators could only write it down as another disappearance, one that involved one of the nation's most visible public figures. That disappearance forced the public to look closer at the triangle, but it was only one among thousands. Researchers point to environmental explanations. Sudden squalls move in with no warning, freezing fog blinds pilots, and downdrafts can ground even skilled flyers in seconds. Yet natural forces can't explain compasses giving false directions or radios cutting to static only inside the triangle. Villagers near its edges describe strange lights hovering in the night sky, claiming aircraft don't just crash, they're taken. Stories of vortexes, energy lines, and even entrances to another world are told with the same seriousness as flight hazard warnings. Whispers of UFO involvement surfaced after entire search operations recovered not a single scrap, as if planes had flown into thin air. For families, though, this doesn't play out in legend. Its lives stopped in mid-sentence, with no body to bury or wreck to examine. Parents die without knowing where their children went. Siblings look up at the ranges each day, convinced the answers are still out there, just hidden by snow and distance. The triangle is not marked on maps, but the stories form an outline clearer than any border. They suggest Alaska is not only remote, but actively erases traces of those who enter. And while the skies above invite legends of ships lifting straight into nothingness, Alaska's waters carry their own this-can't-be-real stories, ones that drift for decades without reaching a shore. In 1931, a steel-hulled cargo ship called the SS Baychimo became trapped in heavy Arctic ice off the coast of Alaska. The vessel belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company and carried fur from trading posts scattered across the north. When the ice refused to break and temperatures dropped, the crew realized there was no way to free their ship before winter. After days of harsh conditions, the company instructed the men to abandon her, taking only what they could carry over the frozen pack. The crew left behind a vessel fully intact, believing she would soon sink beneath the shifting sheets of ice. but the Baychimo refused to go down. Not long after the crew departed, reports came back that the ship had been spotted adrift. Hunters searching for game saw her in near silence, riding free water between ridges of ice. There were no sails set, no sound coming from her deck, yet she moved across the horizon like a stranded shadow. What made this strange was the fact that the Baychimo had been left to die in conditions that had crushed countless ships before her. Instead of breaking apart beneath the shifting ice pressure, she wandered the Arctic, seen one year in one place, then years later, hundreds of miles away. For nearly 4 decades, the ship lived a second life as a phantom of the North. Explorers tried to board her, but storms seemed to arrive without fail, cutting off their plans. More than once, groups reached the drifting ship only to retreat after sudden blizzards sealed off the approach. Inuit hunters reported sightings as clear as day, describing the Baychimo with cargo hatches closed and decks empty. Written accounts from those years confirm that the ship was logged in scattered regions far apart, sometimes appearing solid and steady, other times battered, yet still afloat. The mystery deepened each time she showed herself again. The Arctic is brutal on even reinforced vessels. Hulls crack, rivets snap, timbers and plates alike fall into the pressure of ice. But the Baychimo avoided that end, often described as weather-beaten but unbroken. Crews who managed to step on deck found little but decay. Rust had taken the railings, cabins were splintering, and in some cases ocean spray had frozen the doors in place. Yet the bigger question never had an answer. How could she travel so far for so long without a single watcher at the helm? One documented sighting placed the Baychimo in 1969, her frame still sitting high in the water. That was the last time anyone reliably claimed to see her. After that year, the ship vanished for good. No wreck was discovered, no final report gave confirmation of sinking. She simply disappeared as though she had walked off into the fog and never surfaced again. Even now, when shipping crews talk about strange things on the Arctic horizon, her name comes up. The Baychimo might already rest at the bottom of the sea, or she might someday show her deck again. Until evidence surfaces, her last years remain blank lines in history, a ghost ship that refused an ending. And while the sea kept it secret, Alaska's mountains held another in the hollow shell of a once booming town left to the silence of decay. High in the Wrangell Mountains of Alaska stands a town that once poured out millions of dollars worth of copper ore. The place was called Kennecott, and in the early 1900s, it was one of the richest mining operations in the world. Workers came from across the country to live in the remote settlement, where a complex of mills, bunkhouses, and company buildings grew against the ice-covered peaks. At its height, trains carried out load after load of concentrated copper, and wages from the mine supported families in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. For a short time, the town looked permanent, almost untouchable. But Kennecott's success came to an abrupt end. By the 1930s, the ore veins had run so thin that the copper was no longer worth pulling from the rock. The company that owned the settlement made the call to stop operations. Within weeks, families packed what belongings they could and boarded trains out of the mountains. It was not a slow decline. It was an almost overnight departure. Whole buildings remained stocked with furniture, tools sat where they had been last used, and the towering mill stood silent above empty streets. In isolation, nature moved back in, but the abandoned structures carried more than weather damage. They carried stories. Mining was never safe work, and in Kennecott the cost was human lives. Accidents were common in the dark tunnels, with men crushed beneath sudden rockfalls or trapped after cave-ins sealed the shafts. Some never made it to daylight again. Rumors spread of workers who still lingered, their voices caught in the echo of blasting charges and the churning of machinery. As decades passed, explorers who came to see the abandoned site repeated the same unsettling claims. They said they heard footsteps in tunnels no one entered and faint voices calling from deeper into the earth, where lights appeared without lamps or generators. The most striking part of Kennecott is the 14-story mill building, still standing against the side of the mountain. This massive structure once processed the ore that made the town rich, but now its dark windows look out over the valley like watchful eyes. Inside, wooden staircases creak under the weight of visitors who sometimes swear they feel a presence moving just behind them. With no power since the 1930s, small flashes of light reported in its corridors have no simple explanation. Guides often warn that sound travels strangely here, but many who step inside leave convinced they were not alone. Kennecott became a ghost town in more than one sense. What was once a symbol of progress and wealth has frozen in time, its buildings preserved against decay, yet carrying silence heavier than any mine rock. Travelers today describe the place as eerie, as though its people had only been gone a few minutes rather than nearly a century. Between fact and folklore, the site remains both a historic landmark and a reputed haunted relic of Alaska's mountains, standing as a reminder that prosperity can vanish, but the echoes of those who built it may never leave. From the hushed mills and quiet streets of Kennecott, stories turn away from stone and steel toward legends born in the rivers and forests, where survival was tied to older and far stranger warnings. Along the rivers and icy coastlines of Alaska, there are creatures said to look like otters at first glance. They stand on two legs, gesture like humans, and sometimes even speak in familiar voices. According to the Tlingit people, these beings are called the Kushtaka, shapeshifters who move between human and otter form. To someone meeting them near the water, they appear harmless or even welcoming, but the stories warn that they lead people toward the current, where the freezing water finishes what they begin. The Kushtaka are not described in a single way. In some stories, they rescue drowning men and return them to shore, giving them the strength to live through the night. In others, they are much darker. They mimic the sound of people crying for help, drawing rescuers into dangerous waters before dragging them under. The dual nature makes them disturbing. They can be both savior and executioner, leaving no certainty about what form you meet on the riverbank. People say that when someone drowns unexpectedly in calm waters, it is the Kushtaka at work, not simple misfortune. Because of these beliefs, many deaths in Alaska's rivers and coastal waters are explained through this lens. Fishermen lost in mild conditions, or hunters who left tracks right up to the water's edge and then nothing more. The Kushtaka are blamed. The fear around them led to very specific protections. Copper in any shape was thought to repel them. Dogs served as guardians, able to sense their presence before humans could. Fire discouraged them, as did urine, which might sound strange but was carried out as a form of protection in moments of desperation. These practices were taught seriously, with no suggestion that the stories were only for children. There is a deeper meaning behind the legend. The rivers and glacial inlets that cut through Alaska are not forgiving. One misstep on a bank, one choice to chase a sound into a dark place, and cold water can take life in moments. The Kushtaka stories worked as warnings passed down through generations. They told children not to follow voices into the woods, not to get too close to the edge, and not to underestimate the silent pull of these rivers. But survivors who claim to see a shape moving like a man before sinking into the water believe it is more than caution. Some of the most chilling stories describe travelers who believed they were following another person, bent over and calling for assistance, only to notice moments too late that it moved like an animal. By then, they were deep in unfamiliar terrain, often close to dangerous rapids, and in some cases they couldn't get back safely. Modern accounts echo this, with accidents or vanishings said to have Kushtaka written across them. Not everyone accepts these explanations, but in communities where the old legends endure, people still point to the creature instead of chance. The Kushtaka sit in that space between protective folklore and actual fear, a story meant to build discipline, yet one credited with real disappearances. And while rivers whisper their warnings through stories of shapeshifters, the sea stories are not so symbolic. They end with wreckage, lives lost, and ships that never made it home. On October 23, 1918, the Canadian passenger steamship SS Princess Sophia left Skagway, Alaska, carrying more than 300 people. The vessel traveled south along the Lynn Canal, a dangerous stretch of water lined with rocky reefs and subject to powerful storms. As night fell, snow was reported in the channel. Visibility went from limited to almost nothing. At around 2 in the morning, the ship struck Vanderbilt Reef, a jagged formation of rock sitting just beneath the water's surface. The steel hull locked onto the reef, and the Princess Sophia was stranded in place as heavy waves began to slam against her sides. Rescue vessels soon tried to approach, but the weather worsened by the hour. Gale-force winds churned up icy water, sheets of snow dropped visibility to zero, and sharp rocks blocked any chance of getting close. Those on board were trapped. For more than 40 hours, passengers waited in freezing temperatures as the sea pounded their ship. Steam heat provided little relief, and survivors of other storms described conditions like being inside a freezing cage. Families huddled together while search vessels hovered nearby, unable to carry out an evacuation in the rough water. The decision was made to wait for calmer seas, and that wait became a death sentence. What makes the story of the Princess Sophia so chilling are the final details left behind. During those endless hours, passengers knew the outcome was uncertain. A number began writing farewell notes to loved ones, using scraps of paper and anything they could manage in the dimly lit cabins. Some messages explained where personal belongings could be found, while others were simple goodbyes meant for spouses and children. These letters were later pulled from pockets and purses, stained by oil from the wreck but still readable. They remain a haunting archive of the passengers' last thoughts before the end. By the afternoon of October 25th, the storm reached its peak. Seas rose higher, and snow continued. Around 5 p.m., in conditions no one could observe directly, the Princess Sophia finally slid off the reef. The ship broke apart almost immediately. Rescue boats stationed nearby reported later they could not even see the disaster unfold due to visibility. When they moved in after the storm eased, the wreckage stretched across the surface of the water, with bodies floating in a thick coat of oil from the ship's fuel. Every single one of the 353 passengers and crew had died. There were no survivors. Recovery teams entered the broken vessel and found cabins filled with lifeless men, women, and children. Clothes were soaked in oil and ice. The letters that families had written remained clutched in their hands or inside their pockets. To investigators, this became one of the most tragic maritime disasters to ever strike Alaska. For historians, it is the sheer sense of time frozen, the weight, the notes, and the sudden end that still stands out more than a century later. People continue to debate whether a riskier rescue attempt earlier might have saved lives, or if the storm guaranteed the fate of all aboard. The site of Vanderbilt Reef holds no memorial, but remains a permanent maritime grave marked by maps. The Princess Sophia never gave its passengers a chance to escape. Instead, it created a snapshot of fear, patience, and silence that ended in death. And in a land where storms bring disaster, starvation brings its own legends of men who become something less than human. In Alaska's most remote corners, there are stories of men who went out during brutal winters and came back never the same. Families said hunger had stripped away their humanity. They returned quiet at first, then restless, their eyes hollow, and their movements strange. Not long after, those men were no longer recognized as people at all. They had become something Alaskans whispered about only at night, the Wendigo of the North. The Wendigo legend is most often tied to Algonquian tribes further east, but the spirit of the story carried into Alaska's wilderness, where starvation was a constant threat. In a land where temperatures drop below zero for weeks and hunting can fail for an entire season, warnings about cannibalism were spoken directly. The tale went that a man who ate human flesh in desperation would not simply survive, he would lose himself entirely. What stood in his place after was a predator, consumed by hunger with no end. Isolation created the perfect conditions for these stories to take hold. Entire cabins could be buried by snow, trapping families in place. Hunters might vanish for weeks, searching for food that never came. When men returned from those journeys gaunt and changed, their families sometimes swore they were not the same men who had left. They spoke of new tempers, sudden violence, and an emptiness that frightened even the strongest elders. To explain it, people turned to the Wendigo. Parents passed down sharp warnings to children on winter nights. They said, "Never, under any circumstance, take human flesh into your mouth, or you will call the Wendigo into yourself." The rule was not only told as a spiritual danger, but as a survival law. Desperation could push people close to crossing that line, and once crossed, it was believed there was no return. A Wendigo was never satisfied. Even after eating, the craving only grew stronger. Accounts describe gaunt figures taller than the men they once were, faces drawn in horrific shapes, voices strained and unnatural. Families locked doors not to keep out wolves, but to guard against men they once knew. Some hunters swore they were stalked by shapes moving just beyond firelight, thin forms that loped silently across the snow. It was impossible to prove what was seen through blizzards, yet the fear that settled in the villages was real. Historians argue this might describe psychological breakdowns brought on by starvation and cold. Starving bodies grow weak, minds slip into confusion, and paranoia can settle quickly. Violence may follow as judgment deteriorates. But for families whose loved ones came back unrecognizable, who muttered about voices in the wind or attacked without warning, the explanation of simple madness never felt complete. To them, they had seen a person fall into the Wendigo's grip. In some communities, these stories have been told for centuries, believed as much as they were feared. They remain a chilling reminder that the cold can erode the body and the mind, and in Alaska, hunger itself becomes a spirit of terror. From hunters altered by starvation, the next story turns to one man who simply vanished during a mountain race, witnessed by hundreds but never seen again. On July 4, 2012, a 65-year-old man named Michael LeMaitre stepped up to the start line of one of Alaska's hardest physical challenges, the Mount Marathon Race in Seward. The event has been going on for decades. Competitors run straight up the mountain, climbing nearly 3,000 feet in less than a mile, and then turn around and race back down through loose rock, slick mud, and barely visible trails. Injuries are so common that participants often finish bloodied and bruised, and some never make it to the top at all. For Michael, it was his first time competing, but he carried a determined reputation and told friends he wanted to prove he could finish the course even at his age. For much of the climb, spectators kept eyes on him. Mount Marathon draws large crowds every summer, with people gathering in downtown Seward, at checkpoints on the slope, and even on the ridgeline above. Witnesses saw Michael making steady progress upward. His pace was slow, but he was still climbing long after younger racers had already turned and flown past on their descent. Dozens of runners reported passing him, and spotters higher up confirmed that he continued toward the top, refusing to quit even as weather rolled in and daylight began to fade. At some point past 6 in the evening, however, the updates stopped. No one clearly saw him reach the turnaround at the top, and no one can say they saw him begin his way down again. From that point on, Michael LeMaitre disappeared. When he failed to return to the finish line, officials assumed he was still on the ridge and immediately launched a search. Race organizers called in helicopters, which crisscrossed the steep slope with spotlights and infrared scanners. Volunteers combed the lower trails, shouting his name, while experienced mountain rescue teams investigated gullies where a fall might have hidden him. Night after night, the searches yielded nothing. The sheer volume of help was striking. Seward is a small town, but the entire community showed up. Hundreds of volunteers joined official searchers, scouring talus fields and ravines, checking every possible route. Helicopters flew for 2 full weeks over jagged cliffs and snow patches, even dipping into crevices in the hope that Michael had slipped out of view. Search dogs were deployed, but not a single item of clothing, shoe print, or trace of blood was discovered. After days turned into weeks, officials began to admit there was no sign at all to indicate where he had gone. Theories started soon after. Some believed he may have become disoriented near the summit, wandered off the course, and fallen into terrain not visible even from helicopters. Others speculated he could have entered a snowfield and slipped into a hidden crevasse, buried instantly. People who knew Michael pushed back, saying he was stubborn, not reckless, and would have fought hard to come down. Yet without a single shred of evidence, each explanation remained guesswork. To this day, no remains have been recovered. Unlike remote disappearances in the backcountry, Michael's case happened in front of a crowd, in daylight, on a mountain covered by one of the largest searches in race history. He remains a ghost presence in the Mount Marathon race, a runner who vanished where hundreds were watching, leaving a shadow that still unsettles the town each 4th of July. From that loss in plain sight, another disappearance followed in Alaska that drew national attention, this time involving powerful figures in Washington. On October 16, 1972, a twin-engine Cessna 310 left Anchorage with a flight plan for Juneau. On board were 4 people. The passengers included U.S. Congressman Nick Begich of Alaska and Congressman Hale Boggs of Louisiana, who at the time was one of the highest-ranking members of the House of Representatives. Hale Boggs had served as House Majority Leader and was a well-known national figure. With them were a political aide named Russell Brown and the pilot, Don Johns, an experienced flyer who had made many trips through Alaska's rugged terrain. At first, the trip looked routine. The plane left Anchorage on schedule and flew into cloudy but not uncommon conditions for Alaska. Somewhere in the region between Anchorage and Juneau, contact with the aircraft was lost. The last transmission came early in the flight, then nothing more. No emergency call ever went out, and no one reported seeing the aircraft in distress. When the plane failed to arrive in Juneau, officials immediately realized something was wrong. The disappearance sparked one of the most extraordinary search efforts in American history. Over the course of several weeks, more than 50 military and civilian aircraft swept across the wilderness. Ships patrolled Alaska's coastline. Ground teams moved across mountain passes, valleys, and river corridors. It became the largest search in U.S. aviation history up to that point. In total, thousands of flight hours were logged, each covering territory carefully mapped out by search teams. Despite all of that effort, not one fragment of the plane was ever located. No wreckage, no life jackets, No landing attempt gone wrong. Nothing. The total absence of physical evidence made the case remarkable. Aircraft accidents in Alaska are unfortunately common, but they usually leave at least shards of metal or fuel traces that point to a location. In this case, the wilderness gave nothing back. Because Hale Boggs was such a public figure, the disappearance quickly became the subject of speculation. Some suggested the plane had crashed into a glacier where the wreck could have been swallowed whole by ice and snow. Others argued that turbulence or icing may have downed the plane in a remote valley too inaccessible for searchers to scan. But a darker set of theories emerged almost immediately, pointing to Boggs' political enemies. He had been outspoken in Washington, and he had served on the Warren Commission, the group that investigated the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. His criticism of the FBI and other powerful figures led some to suggest his vanishing was not an accident at all. Critics raised the possibility of intentional disappearance, though no hard evidence ever supported that. Still, the combination of his status, the scale of the search, and the complete lack of wreckage fueled suspicions. To this day, there are people who argue the crash site may still rest undiscovered somewhere in Alaska's wilderness, waiting under snowfields or in valleys too remote to draw attention. Others remain convinced the answers were hidden long ago. The Hale Boggs disappearance endures as one of America's most chilling aviation mysteries. And in Alaska, not only the influential vanish, ordinary hunters too sometimes walk into the trees and never return. Two brothers, the Ricketts, prepared for a hunting trip in Alaska like they had many times before. They packed their rifles, food, and camping gear and made the drive toward remote country inside the region locals point to as part of the Alaska Triangle. Friends remembered the brothers as careful outdoorsmen who knew how quickly weather could change and how dangerous the land could be. They were last seen heading into thick wilderness before taking up camp in an area that promised game but also carried all the risks that come with hunting far from roads or neighbors. That was the last anyone saw them alive. Days later, when they failed to return, a search effort was launched. What rescuers found was unsettling and confusing. Their camp was still standing, tents intact, supplies where they had been carefully stored, and rifles left behind, as if the hunters had walked out and planned to return within minutes. Meals still sat untouched, as though they had been ready to eat shortly before leaving the site. The fire pit was cold but orderly, not a sign of panic or hurried departure. Everything appeared lifeless, but not abandoned in the way hunters usually leave when they decide to move camp or cut their trip short. It didn't look like choice, it looked like interruption. Searchers fanned out from the camp. They expected at least some trail, boot prints, or signs of an encounter with wildlife. Alaska has grizzly bears capable of ambushing hunters, wolves with keen senses, and terrain where one wrong step can drop a person into a hidden crevice. But investigators could not find blood, torn clothing, or evidence of struggle. The supplies left at camp raised more questions. Why would seasoned hunters step away without weapons, without food, even without leaving word to each other? To carry nothing in Alaska's backcountry was to walk vulnerable into a place where nature doesn't forgive. Some suggested the brothers followed something out of camp, perhaps an animal they tracked without thinking to bring gear. Others thought one might have been in trouble, and the second rushed after him. But then, why no sign of either of them in the surrounding area? Dogs combed wide stretches of landscape, helicopters searched from above, and volunteer groups moved line after line through brush and stream. The brothers' presence vanished past the boundary of camp as if they'd been erased. For the local community, the fact that their guns and food were untouched made natural explanations feel less secure. These were not naive hunters. Both men had grown up outdoors and knew survival basics too well to wander off with nothing. And yet, with no tracks, no equipment found later downstream or down mountainside, searches eventually stopped with no recovery at all. The families were never given closure. Year after year, loved ones were left with speculation, from sudden animal attack to the stranger accusations that always rise around the Alaska Triangle. Some who live nearby say human absence alone tells the story, that the land itself claims who it chooses, without leaving answers. The Ricketts Brothers became another pair of names added to Alaska's long record of unsolved vanishings. Hunters in prime condition, swallowed after making camp, their absence impossible to explain by the objects they left behind. Two men walked into the woods together and never came back, setting their story among the most haunting disappearances in the region. Just as their campsite was discovered abandoned in stillness, another mystery waited farther off in ice country, where tents were found scattered across a glacier with no one inside. Searchers moving across the base of the Malaspina Glacier expected the same emptiness that defines much of Alaska's ice fields. What they found instead stopped them in their tracks. Scattered across the cold surface were several tents, pitched in clear lines, the kind of camp set up by people who planned to stay for days. Sleeping bags lay rolled half open. Supplies, including food, packs, and even clothing, sat waiting. But the people who had lived there were gone. Not one person remained, and no trace explained why they had left. The discovery grew stranger the longer investigators looked. Nothing in the camp suggested panic or attack. The tents had not been clawed open by wildlife, nor had they collapsed from weather. Meals were left behind in a state that suggested the campers might have only stepped away for a short walk. Boots, knives, and even emergency gear sat unused. In Alaska, where survival depends on preparation, no one deliberately leaves such things behind. Glacial winds whipped across the canvas openings but revealed no prints, no tracks, no hint of where the group had gone. The land itself seemed to erase them. The Malaspina Glacier is notorious for swallowing evidence. Its surface is part ice, part rock, and constantly shifting. A single gust can cover boot prints in seconds, while storms press snow into smooth sheets overnight. Search teams reported that despite looking across a wide radius, the terrain remained blank. It gave no signal of direction, no broken line of snow, no traces drawn into drifts. It was as if the campers had risen at the same moment, walked into the white, and dissolved. The silence struck rescuers more than anything. With no sound of rushing river, no birds, and only the muted groan of the glacier, the setting itself felt staged against them. They called out names and whistled for echoes, hearing nothing but their own voices fall flat. Even experienced mountaineers admitted it felt unnatural. The energy of the place seemed suspended, with empty tents standing like monuments to people who had been erased overnight. The scene has often been compared to Russia's Dyatlov Pass mystery, another case where tents were left intact while the occupants disappeared under unexplained circumstances. In both, human presence was reduced to camps without people. This parallel gave life to theories of sudden fear. Some believe unseen forces or natural events caused the campers to flee at once, perhaps an avalanche forming in the distance that never arrived, or the cracking ice groaning loud enough to send them running. Others argue hypothermia or disorientation could have played a role. In severe cold, people sometimes make irrational choices, even stripping layers or abandoning secure shelter. But others are not satisfied by simple answers. Local accounts speculate about things beyond weather, shadows in the snow, figures that can only be seen for a moment, or a force in the glacier that pushes people off the map. Each suggestion remains theory only, but the unease lingers because the evidence stops at the tents. When searchers finally left the site, no bodies were collected and no explanation reached. The Malaspina Glacier story ended with camps frozen in place, the outlines of human life cut short without closure. Empty shelters stand in memory of movements, routines, and intentions, but nothing more. And from those silent camps, the conversation shifts to another kind of presence in the Arctic. Phantom hounds said to stalk travelers under snowbound skies. Travelers moving across the frozen tundra sometimes described a dark shape appearing behind them on the horizon. At first glance, it looked like a large dog, but as they watched it more closely, small details unsettled them. Its fur seemed thin, almost hairless, black against the white of the snow. Its eyes were dark and reflective, and the most disturbing detail, it left no tracks, not one imprint, even when snow was soft enough that a human footprint sank to the ankle. Among Inuit tradition, this creature carried a name, the Keelut. The Keelut is often classified as a spirit animal from the Arctic, neither part of the natural world nor completely separate. It is said to appear to lone travelers, particularly those moving across wide tundra where no forests or landmarks offered protection. People believed the Keelut followed silently, keeping just enough distance to be seen, but never coming close all at once. Those who reported seeing it grew convinced of one truth: when the Keelut set eyes on you, there was no return. Soon after, misfortune struck, whether through freezing, accident, or disappearance without explanation. Accounts of these encounters built long before they were written down. Hunters on sled journeys described looking over their shoulders again and again to see the black dog pacing parallel footsteps with them, though the snow remained untouched. Others said they felt its presence behind them for hours before turning and finding nothing, only to glance back minutes later and see the creature again in the distance. The Keelut became known not just as an animal spirit, but as a warning of death waiting nearby. To see it meant an ending was close. Descriptions repeat with consistency across different stories. The Quileute is said to be larger than a common dog, its body gaunt, its coat thin to the point of appearing bare, and its paws uncanny in their ability to move across the tundra without leaving marks. For some, this detail separated it from a simple animal sighting. In snow so deep that sled tracks hardened into grooves overnight, even wolves left trails behind. The Quileute left nothing at all. Skeptics have suggested these experiences fit the symptoms of snow blindness or hypothermia. Prolonged exposure to cold can confuse senses, and combined with isolation, hallucinations can feel extremely real. In moments of exhaustion, a traveler could imagine a presence that was never there. But the problem with this theory lies in how widespread and detailed the accounts are. Villages separated by hundreds of miles described nearly identical creatures long before modern contact spread those stories outward. For generations, elders warned the young never to ignore the sight of a silent follower in the snow. They told them to head back, to seek shelter, never to press forward. Families carried these warnings seriously, as more than superstition, because in some communities the dark truth remained. Individuals who spoke of being tracked by the Quileute often disappeared shortly after. They never reached the next camp or settlement. Their names were remembered alongside sightings, tied to stories used as both caution and survival reminder. In Alaska's vast tundra, where even a brief mistake costs lives, the Quileute remains one of the most feared legends. Whether a hallucination born from the cold or a predator beyond biology, it endures. For some, myths of Alaska are protective stories. For others, they stand as proof that danger itself grows fangs in the wilderness. And from a solitary beast stalking empty snowfields, whispers carry of an entire village that surrendered to fear in the forest and walked away overnight. In the 1940s, the small fishing town of Portlock on Alaska's Kenai Peninsula came to an abrupt end. Families who had built lives around the local cannery, who had steady incomes processing salmon and living in neat wooden homes along the shoreline, suddenly packed up and walked away. Their departure was not gradual, and it was not planned the way most communities fade from industry changes. Instead, it was as if the entire town had been emptied in a matter of days. Trunks sat half full. Tools were left on benches. Cans of food were stacked on kitchen shelves. The absence of people was not explained by business failure or bad weather. It was explained by fear. For years before the abandonment, residents had spoken about walking into the forests behind Portlock and feeling watched. Hunters who went out for caribou or to track bear were sometimes found later, but the way they were found disturbed the rest of the camp. Their bodies showed signs of unnatural violence. Limbs appeared twisted, and some men looked as if they had been torn apart. Others were never recovered at all. Among the villagers, a name circulated for what they believed had done this. They called it the Nantianak, a massive presence said to stalk the ridges beyond the tree line. It was described as giant and human-like, but closer to a predator than a man. Those who remained in Portlock through the early 1940s remembered hearing noises from the woods at night. Screams tore through the dark in places no voices should have reached. Large shapes moved at the edge of torchlight, and residents admitted they felt surrounded by something they could not fight. When the next set of bodies was discovered in the brush, mutilated in a way that animals would not have done, the breaking point came. Families gathered their goods, boarded boats, and left. No one stayed behind to protect homes or collect what was owed. The fear of entering the woods had finally spilled into the town itself. The most unusual detail was the completeness with which Portlock collapsed. Usually, when an industry town shuts down, a few residents linger. Somebody tries to sell or repurpose the site. In this case, Portlock was left without a single permanent family. What had grown into a working village became abandoned land. The cannery closed, houses stood empty, and tools rusted beneath the ocean air. Locals in neighboring regions knew the story, and none of them chose to take over what had been abandoned. The name Portlock itself became associated only with the warnings. People said it was cursed ground. Even after more than half a century, the ruins remain largely untouched. The foundations of homes can still be seen in the overgrown grass. The pilings of the old cannery still press out into the bay, and paths descend into forest trails that no one dares to follow alone. The stories of Nantianak persist, of shadows moving in the branches and cries that echo where no people live. Portlock stands as one of Alaska's only documented examples of an entire town walking away in terror, silent signs of a community left to whatever haunted it. And out of those stories, attention shifts toward the creature itself, described not just as a figure in myth, but as a killer known as the Hairy Man of Portlock. The stories from Portlock did not stop at shadows in the trees or distant screams. Survivors described something far more direct, a towering figure that hunted men. They spoke of a beast taller than any human, covered in thick hair, with shoulders so broad that witnesses said it seemed more like a creature built for violence than survival. This figure was known simply as the Hairy Man, and for people in Portlock, it was no myth. It was the reason bodies appeared in the forest broken and torn apart, left in ways no animal could explain. Locals blamed the Hairy Man every time someone went missing or when hunters came back in pieces from the hills behind the town. They described him as part man, part something primal, striding upright but massive in weight and power. Some said his tracks could be found along riverbanks, prints too large to belong to any human being, and yet they would vanish into thick brush, as if the ground itself concealed his trail. The fear became a constant presence in daily life. Even men who carried rifles chose to travel only in groups, wary of stepping into the woods alone. Descriptions of the Hairy Man echoed Sasquatch stories told elsewhere in North America, but with one major difference: this figure was violent. Accounts of Bigfoot often mention evasive behavior, creatures spotted briefly before disappearing back into the trees. In Portlock, witnesses said the Hairy Man followed hunters, watched them from tree lines, and at times attacked. Bodies were recovered with bones splintered, skulls crushed in ways that suggested force far beyond human strength. These were not peaceful sightings of some shy forest dweller. They were warnings of a predator that stalked the edges of settlement. The continuing deaths created unbearable tension. Fishermen avoided the coastline near the mouth of the forest. Hunters gave up their grounds even when food was scarce. Stories spread beyond the town, and the reputation of the Hairy Man became known across other Alaskan villages. People compared their own strange encounters in the wilderness to what was happening in Portlock, but no other place had the same scale of fear. An entire community lived under the dread that each trip into the trees might end in screams or silence. What unsettled outsiders was how deeply rooted this fear became. Even skeptics who doubted anything supernatural existed could not overlook what the townspeople chose to do. Fear alone was enough to force the evacuation of Portlock. Families abandoned strong homes, thriving fisheries, and steady income without relocation plans, preferring to risk poverty over another night hearing strange cries in the dark. That decision alone spoke louder than any legend. Rational or not, they believed something hunted them. Stories from survivors continued long after the town was left empty. Men spoke of walking through a clearing and seeing a shape standing still against the trees, too large to ignore. Others claimed the creature hurled rocks at cabins or stalked hunting parties before melting back into the forest without trace. These stories carried no neat explanation, only testimony that something impossible to explain had driven them out. In the end, the Hairy Man stands as the only beast so feared it erased a town. Portlock remains an abandoned site because of it. And while one community fled from its presence, other northern legends described entire villages that disappeared, leaving behind nothing but fires still burning. The story goes that an entire village disappeared without warning along the shore of Anjikuni Lake. Hunters moving through the region claimed they found rows of cabins still standing, food resting on tables, and even firewood stacked and burning. The image is striking, smoke rising from chimneys while no one remained at home. Meals had gone cold, clothes hung where they had been left, and fishing gear leaned against walls as though families had only stepped out for a short errand. Yet no voices answered, no footsteps returned. The community had emptied as though its people had been erased at the same moment. Although the earliest written accounts tie this mystery to a remote settlement in Canada, the story echoes through Alaskan tradition. Frontier communities in the north often shared tales with neighbors across borders, and this one caught attention for its imagery of sudden absence. Alaskan oral histories began repeating versions of the event, sometimes changing the setting to a local riverbank or lakeside village. The theme remained constant, entire groups of people gone, leaving belongings behind as if interrupted mid-life. That theme has held for decades as one of the most unsettling reminders of how fragile human presence can be in such overwhelming wilderness. The most persistent detail is how ordinary the scenes appeared. Families did not pack bags or scatter belongings in flight. Instead, cabins looked frozen in a moment, with half-finished meals. fires glowing steady, and cooking pots not yet cooled. These details carry a weight that simple migration stories do not. They speak of life in progress, routines not broken by choice but cut off unexpectedly. To walk into such a camp would feel like stepping into the middle of a day that had just been abandoned minutes earlier, only the people missing, their absence louder than any noise. Historians who have studied the Anjikuni account point to exaggeration. They argue early newspaper stories may have distorted seasonal movements of nomadic families, turning departure into disappearance. Migrating to follow better hunting grounds or fish runs would have been ordinary practice, and outsiders unfamiliar with those customs might have viewed it as shocking abandonment. Over time, the story may have grown, each retelling adding fuel burning in the hearth or stew cooling on the table until the image became locked as a mystery. Skeptics stress that no outside evidence ever proved such a disappearance, only the claim itself. Even so, the power of the legend lies in its repetition. The sight of fires burning in empty villages occurs again and again in northern folklore, told from Alaska to the Canadian territories. In oral history, these images serve as warnings of the wilderness' ability to take at once. They reveal cultural fears of collective disappearance, not merely one hunter lost in storm or one traveler fading into the trees, but entire villages swallowed by forces beyond understanding. For the people who tell it, it proves that remoteness can erase not just individuals, but whole communities without trace. Whether Anjikuni was myth or misunderstood event, the underlying truth remains. In northern wilderness, isolation looms so large that it can consume human life completely. The silence of one cabin unvisited is haunting. An entire village left unfinished is terrifying. From villages lost overnight, stories move next toward another group of men who faced not vanishing but madness under the endless snow of Alaska's tundra. The story of the Hale prospectors begins like many others in Alaska. A small group of men, led by Thomas Hale, set out across the tundra in the hope of finding enough gold to change their lives. They carried the usual supplies: rifles for protection, dry food, tents, and tools for panning. The records show they had enough provisions for weeks, but the farther they pushed into the wilderness, the thinner those supplies ran. What makes their journey remembered is not the search for gold itself, but the fragments they left behind when everything collapsed. When rescuers made it to the camp, they did not find bodies. They found scraps, scattered pages, scraps of a journal, and pieces of equipment left half-packed. Through those pages came the only account of what happened, written in uneven handwriting that grew more disturbed the longer the entries went on. At first, the notes described the ordinary struggles of prospecting: long, cold days, short rations, arguments among tired men. But soon, the words shift into something else, describing noises outside the tents at night, shadows on the horizon that never approached, but never left either. The men began to believe they were being followed. The journals describe steps in the snow, heavy and deliberate, though none of the men claimed responsibility. When one of them went out to trace the footprints, he allegedly found they led nowhere, cut into the white and then vanished. Whether paranoia or truth, the entries describe a growing fear that someone or something out there was watching the camp. Small disputes escalated into fights, and fights turned into accusations. The cold and starvation pressed down harder. By the final entries, food was almost gone, and the words read more like frantic scratches than thoughts. Descriptions of men turning on each other, claims that one had gone missing, and another insisting someone prowled the edges of camp. Rescuers pieced together little from what remained. Most of the supplies were scattered, but not all taken, which argued against a simple robbery. The men's valuables were untouched. What was left of the journals suggested either violent crime or madness born in isolation. Some investigators leaned toward starvation psychosis. Hunger can drive hallucinations and distrust, enough that men might believe themselves hunted by a phantom. Others believed a real intruder could have stalked their camp, waiting for the group to weaken. The words on those pages remain the only evidence. "It's watching us," one entry read, though no proof explained who or what it was. The handwriting differed slightly, suggesting multiple men wrote parts of the record before the final days. After that, the trail stops. No bodies, no final stand, just silence. For historians, the Hale prospectors stand as a reminder of how thin the line is between fortune-seeking and disaster in Alaska. The moment provisions failed, survival crashed into fear and suspicion, and what the men perceived as a hunter in the dark erased their last judgment. With no bodies recovered, their fate is left to guesswork. The journals remain the only voice of the camp, fragments frozen in time that hint at madness, desperation, and something beyond the circle of the fire. From these writings of doom, the stories turn next toward another group who faced overwhelming force, climbers swallowed by a blizzard that left no trace. 7 climbers set out to face one of Alaska's high peaks, a team of experienced mountaineers used to working in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. They had made careful plans, carried enough food to last for weeks, and packed ropes, tents, and all the standard safety gear. These were not beginners, but a team prepared for sudden weather shifts and long waits on the slopes. The climb began well, but their challenge would only be remembered for how it ended. By the time rescuers reached their camp, every one of them had disappeared, leaving behind a scene that looked both orderly and unsettling. The group had set up camp high on the mountain when a blizzard struck. Conditions in Alaska's peaks can go from manageable to deadly in a matter of hours. Winds tore at the tents, snow pressed down so heavy that even standing upright became difficult, and visibility dropped until climbers could not see the end of their own ropes. For days, no one heard from the team. When the storm cleared, a search was launched. Helicopters scanned slopes, ground teams made slow progress upward, and after hours of effort, they managed to reach the last known site of the expedition. What they found was strange. The camp remained standing. Food bags were still packed, cooking supplies lay ready but unused. Inside the shelters, equipment had not been scattered or carried off by the weather. To anyone walking over snow and stone, it looked like the climbers had stepped out only moments earlier, but the details became more confusing with every inspection. Ropes had been cut clean, as though deliberately severed, not snapped by force. Paths away from the camp were absent because snowfall had wiped the slate clean. No tracks marked an escape. Search teams spread out across the surrounding acres of ice and cliff, expecting to find at least a fragment of evidence: clothing snagged on rock, a glove frozen into drifts, a mark of someone stumbling in the storm. Nothing appeared. Despite one of the largest alpine search efforts in the region, not a single body was recovered. The absence of 7 men in such a small area left investigators puzzled. Natural explanations made sense. A blizzard could disorient climbers, sweep them off ridges, and bury them under meters of snow. But usually, storms leave signs. In this case, it left nothing at all. Foul play was considered, as though some argument or stranger had cut the ropes, but evidence would not line up. No weapon, no signs of struggle, no blood on the snow. All rational theories fell short. What remained was unease. Mountaineers who heard about the case said it was as if the storm itself had consumed them, that the mountain had claimed its challengers with no trace left behind. Locals repeated the same idea in starker terms. They said the land itself takes who it wants, and no one can prevent it. Even expert climbers avoided the blizzard zone afterward, admitting that the air there felt wrong, as if they were walking across ground that had swallowed whole a team without leaving a memory. And so the Alaska 7 became another mystery catalogued by the frontier, an event more haunting for its lack of conclusion than any violence or crash. 7 strong men entered a storm, and not even their bodies returned. From a group who vanished in the cold, the next account follows the fate of a single runner whose trail of footprints stopped without reason deep in the forest. Tracks led off the dirt road, down a wooded trail, and then simply ended. That is all searchers had when Amy Roe Bechtel disappeared. She was young, athletic, and had recently settled in the mountain country near the Wyoming-Alaska border region with her husband. On the afternoon she vanished in 1997, Amy drove her car to a popular rural trailhead. This was the kind of place where people trained for marathons, went on long hikes, or simply took in the pine-covered terrain running along the foothills. Her car was found there later, locked, with her belongings inside. But Amy herself never returned from what should have been a routine run. The first wave of searchers looked for the obvious. Her footprints were found leading into the woods, and rescuers followed them with anticipation. But the trail didn't continue. The prints stopped unexpectedly, without signs of struggle, without clear direction. Beyond that point, it was as if she had simply vanished into open air. Search teams spread out in widening circles. They combed the slopes by foot, swept the forest with helicopters, and used dogs trained in search and rescue. Nothing of Amy turned up. In the days after, the absence of evidence only fueled questions. Could she have been attacked by a mountain lion or a bear? Investigators considered it, but noted a predator attack would almost certainly have left traces like blood or torn clothing. Could she have collapsed from exhaustion or injury? Again, teams searching nearby ravines and cliffs found no trace. One of the strongest possibilities investigators looked into was abduction. If someone picked her up along the trail, it might explain why her footprints ended so suddenly. Yet with no witnesses, no tire marks noted at the time, and no body, that possibility remained only that, a theory. Her family never gave up. They spoke often about how Amy had loved the outdoors, how she had dreams of staying in the region long term. In the years that followed, they pressured law enforcement to consider every possible scenario. Investigators sifted through suspects, ranging from strangers spotted in the area to people who knew her personally. But each line of inquiry ended without conclusion. Some focused on the wilderness itself, suggesting Amy may have misstepped into rough terrain past where prints could be followed. Others leaned heavily toward human involvement. The truth was impossible to pin down. National coverage briefly spotlighted her case, yet even with exposure far beyond the local region, no breakthrough came. Tips arrived promising leads but produced nothing concrete. Columnists emphasized the eerie image of prints that stopped mid-forest. Over time, the search quieted, but the family's questions remained as open as they were on that first day. For her husband, relatives, and friends, the hardest part was the lack of closure. Amy's name joined lists of unresolved missing person cases, connected less with any single explanation and more with the chilling uncertainty of silence where a life had been. Her disappearance became one more reminder that in frontier country, people can vanish without trace, not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. And from the fate of one missing runner, the frontier holds yet another story, a site where hunters themselves refuse to enter, still avoided as if something waits among its ruins. Even today, Portlock sits quiet on the Kenai Peninsula, but the silence is not only from its long abandonment. Modern hunters, fishermen, and even researchers still avoid its ruins, saying the ground feels wrong before they even step into the trees. Locals warn newcomers not to stay overnight, and very few challenge that advice. Those who try describe returning quickly, unwilling to press further because of what they experienced. The reasons may sound like echoes of old fears, but to the people who go near the ruins, they are real enough to turn them away for good. In recent decades, efforts have been made to revisit the site. A handful of hunters have admitted walking along its shoreline to fish or poke through old cannery pilings. Others have scouted the land to see whether game remains nearby. While the buildings themselves have collapsed into skeletons, the fear surrounding them is still intact. Those who enter the tree line report a feeling that grows heavier the deeper they go. The memory of how quickly an entire community fled is never far from mind. Seeing the abandoned town firsthand only reinforces that unsettling history. Several accounts describe sudden sounds coming from the forest, sharp enough to be heard clearly over water and wind. Screams are said to echo at night, though no one can identify whether they belong to people, animals, or something else entirely. Large movements have also been reported. Branches crack as though something massive is walking just beyond sight, and shadows shift at the edge of vision in ways that make even experienced outdoorsmen admit they felt stalked. Few push past that point. Most turn back immediately, convinced that what they have witnessed is more than imagination. Hunters make no secret about avoiding Portlock entirely on future trips. Some explain it as superstition, but many note there is no reason to risk unease when there are countless other areas in Alaska rich with game. For them, one unsettling encounter is enough. Entire parties have admitted they will not return, no matter how much potential the land holds for fishing or hunting. In their voices, you hear the same quiet dread described by residents who left in the 1940s. Media attention over the years has only strengthened that reputation. Articles, documentaries, and television crews revisit the story, reminding Alaskans that this is not just an ordinary ghost town left for economic reasons. Each retelling drives home the image of a cursed settlement, a place where something pushed out human life and still waits behind its trees. For locals, seeing outsiders tread its paths only to confirm the same heavy feelings adds to the lasting myth. Another detail unsettles hunters. Animals themselves seem scarce in the area. Game that thrives elsewhere on the peninsula is rarely spotted near Portlock. Fishermen say waters close to the cannery's remains feel strangely vacant. Combined with the silence of the forest, this emptiness turns the wilderness from threatening to almost staged, as though both people and animals sense something is wrong. For all these reasons, Portlock stays empty, Fear lingers, reinforced by story upon story, until the site stands as a place abandoned not by chance but by choice. It remains a ruin avoided by humans and animals alike, surviving proof that some legends hold power long after the last voices leave. And in Alaska, that power quietly reminds us how easily this land erases people and entire histories without explanation. Alaska has a record of loss unlike any other. Thousands have gone missing in its storms, its mountains, and miles of empty wilderness. Some of those people likely lie beneath avalanches or deep within rivers that will never release them. Others simply remain unexplained, gone without any evidence left behind. What makes Alaska different is the pattern of silence after each disappearance. The land does not give up secrets easily. It doesn't just challenge survival, it erases the story itself. That silence leaves families waiting for answers that never come, and those absences echo longer than anything we can explain. If mysteries like this keep you awake, you belong here with us, the last two awake. Subscribe, leave a like, and in the comments tell me, which of these Alaskan mysteries chilled you the most?